What happens when the life you've meticulously built shatters in an instant? When the person you trust most reveals a devastating secret and pushes you out into the cold? This is the story of a man who lost everything he ever worked for, only to discover what truly matters. It's a journey that begins with a brutal betrayal in a sterile New York City apartment and ends with a second chance he never saw coming. Prepare for a story of heartbreak, resilience, and the quiet strength of the human spirit. It will make you question everything you think you know about success and failure. Ethan was the American dream personified. He'd clawed his way out of a dead-end Rust Belt town, fueled by a relentless ambition to escape the generational poverty that had swallowed his family. He put himself through law school, graduating at the top of his class and landing a coveted position at a prestigious Manhattan firm. In just a few years, he had the life he'd only seen in movies, a sprawling loft in Tribeca, a sleek Range Rover, and a beautiful wife, Jessica, who was his whole world. He saw her as his partner, his confidant, his reward for all the sacrifice. But a split second of screeching tires on a rain-slicked highway changed everything. The accident left him with a shattered vertebra and a pair of crutches he couldn't live without. His career, built on 100-hour work weeks and aggressive courtroom tactics, evaporated. The firm let him go with a hollow severance package. And as the money dried up, the cracks in his perfect marriage began to show, revealing a chasm he never knew existed. The stale air in the apartment felt heavy, thick with unspoken words. Ethan watched from the living room archway as Jessica, his Jessica, laughed. It was a light, carefree sound that didn't belong in the wreckage of their life. Next to her stood Trent, a fitness trainer from her high-end gym, his muscles straining the fabric of his t-shirt. He looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting from Jessica's smiling face to Ethan's grim expression. "Ethan, honey, stop looking so tragic," Jessica said, her voice dripping with a sweetness that felt like poison. "It's not a good look." He leaned heavily on his crutches, the polished aluminum cool against his palms. The chronic pain in his back flared, a familiar, fiery reminder of his new reality. He didn't have the energy to yell anymore. The shouting matches of the past few weeks had drained him completely. All he had left was a hollow quietness. "What is he doing here, Jess?" he asked, his voice a low rasp. She just smirked, a cruel little twist of her lips that he'd never seen before, and ran a hand down Trent's arm. The gesture was so casual, so proprietary, it sent a fresh wave of nausea through him. This was his home. "We need to talk about the baby," Jessica continued, her tone shifting to one of feigned seriousness. She placed a hand on her small but noticeable baby bump. For a fleeting moment, a spark of hope ignited in Ethan's chest. The baby, their baby. That was the one thing that could maybe fix this, the one reason to keep fighting. "I'm pregnant, Ethan," she said, her eyes locking onto his. "But here's the thing. I'm not pregnant with your child." The words hung in the air, sucking all the oxygen from the room. Trent shifted his weight, suddenly looking like he'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. Ethan felt nothing. It was as if a switch had been flipped inside him, plunging him into a silent grey emptiness. He didn't feel anger or sadness, just a profound, chilling disconnect from reality. He simply nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. He turned without another word and began the slow, arduous journey back to their bedroom, the rhythmic thud of his crutches on the hardwood floor, the only sound in the apartment. His perfect life hadn't just crumbled. It had been a carefully constructed life from the very beginning, and he was the only one who hadn't been in on the joke. He packed a single duffel bag. The process was slow and clumsy, each movement a negotiation with his protesting body. He grabbed a few shirts, some jeans, his laptop. What else did he need? Everything of value, every piece of art on the walls, every designer chair, had been purchased by Jessica on credit cards he was still paying off. He looked at the framed photo on the nightstand, the two of them in Venice just a year ago, smiling. He looked so happy, so blissfully unaware. He left the photo where it was. As he made his way to the door, Jessica and her lover were whispering in the kitchen. He could have just left, but a cold, calm resolve settled over him. He paused in the doorway. "I'll be gone for good," he said, not looking at them. "The prenup we signed gives you the apartment, everything in it. Just have your lawyer send the divorce papers to my old firm. They'll forward them." Jessica was silent for a moment. Then she said, "Fine. And Ethan? Don't try to contact me." He finally looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw a complete stranger. He nodded, then pulled the heavy door shut behind him, the click of the lock echoing like a final judgment. The Greyhound bus station at Port Authority was a circle of hell, a swirling vortex of desperation and exhaust fumes. Ethan found a seat and stared out the dirty window as the bus rumbled through the Lincoln Tunnel, leaving the glittering, indifferent skyline of Manhattan behind. Each mile felt like a lifetime. He was heading north with no destination in mind, just a vague idea of putting distance between himself and his shattered life. He watched the concrete jungle bleed into the manicured suburbs and then into the dense, dark forests of upstate New York. He remembered hiking here with Jessica once, a lifetime ago. She'd complained about the bugs and the lack of cell service. He'd loved the silence. The bus smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. A child was crying a few rows back. Ethan closed his eyes, the rhythmic motion of the bus a miserable lullaby. He was 29 years old, a disabled, unemployed, soon-to-be divorced man with a few $100s to his name. The American dream had chewed him up and spit him out. He felt like a ghost, an empty shell of the man he used to be. The shame was a physical weight pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. He got off the bus in a small town he didn't recognize, a place with a single main street and a quiet air of forgottenness. He found a taxi and simply said, "Take me to the state park." The driver, an old man with a kind face, looked at him, at his crutches and his haunted eyes, but didn't ask any questions. The park was beautiful and empty. The late autumn air was crisp, and the leaves formed a brilliant carpet of red and gold on the forest floor. He walked for what felt like hours, following a trail that led to a scenic overlook. Below, a river snaked through the valley, a ribbon of silver in the fading light. He sat on a cold stone bench, the weight of his failure crushing him. This was it. This was the end of the line. The thought of suicide wasn't dramatic or violent. It was quiet and seductive, a promise of relief from the relentless pain, both physical and emotional. He thought about his parents, who he hadn't spoken to in years. They had been right. People like him weren't meant to fly so high. The fall was inevitable. He just sat there, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, and waited for the cold to set in. A voice cut through the fog of his despair. "That's a beautiful sunset, isn't it?" He turned, startled. An elderly woman stood a few feet away, holding the leash of a handsome Doberman. She was wrapped in a thick wool coat, her face kind and weathered. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to disturb you," she said, her voice warm. "My name is Eleanor. This is Buddy." The dog sat patiently, his intelligent eyes fixed on Ethan. "Ethan," he managed to say, his voice hoarse. "It's getting cold," Eleanor observed, her gaze gentle but perceptive. "The temperature drops fast out here. Do you have a ride back to town?" He just shook his head, unable to form the words to explain his situation. He couldn't tell this kind stranger that he had nowhere to go, that he had planned on this bench, being his final resting place. She seemed to understand without him saying a word. "Well," she said thoughtfully, "I have a perfectly good guest room and a pot of beef stew on the stove. It's far too much for one old woman and her dog. You'd be doing me a favour." He looked at her, bewildered. A complete stranger was offering him shelter. It didn't make sense. He didn't know why he agreed. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or the simple, undeniable warmth in her eyes. Maybe it was the quiet dignity of the dog, Buddy, who nudged his hand with a cold nose as if to offer his own encouragement. Getting into her old but well-maintained Subaru was an ordeal, but Eleanor was patient, never making him feel like a burden. They drove in silence for a few miles down a winding country road, before turning onto a gravel driveway that led to a charming, secluded cabin nestled among the pine trees on the edge of a lake. A light was on in the window, casting a golden, welcoming glow. "Here we are," she said. "It's not much, but it's home." The inside was the complete opposite of his stark, modern apartment. It was filled with worn, comfortable furniture, shelves overflowing with books, and the comforting scent of wood smoke and cinnamon. A fire was crackling in a stone fireplace. It felt like a sanctuary, a place untouched by the cold, hard world he had just escaped. Eleanor led him to a small, cosy bedroom. "The bathroom is just down the hall," she said. "Come out for stew when you're ready. Don't be shy." He sat on the edge of the bed, the silence of the cabin broken only by the crackle of the fire and the gentle ticking of a grandfather clock in the main room. He should have been on guard, suspicious of this strange woman's kindness. The world he knew, the world of New York law and corporate backstabbing, didn't allow for such random acts of charity. Everyone had an angle, but looking around the simple, honest room, he couldn't find one. He eventually made his way to the kitchen, where Eleanor was ladling thick, fragrant stew into 2 bowls. They ate at a rustic wooden table, Buddy lying at Eleanor's feet with a contented sigh. She didn't press him with questions. She talked about the changing seasons, the stubbornness of the local deer who ate her prize-winning roses, and Buddy's silly habit of chasing squirrels in his sleep. Her conversation was a gentle balm on his raw nerves. For the first time in months, he felt a flicker of something other than pain and despair. He didn't know what it was, but it was enough to make him want to see the sun rise one more time. That night, for the first time since the accident, he slept without nightmares. The next few days passed in a quiet, healing blur. Ethan spent most of his time in his room, sleeping or staring blankly at the wall. Eleanor left a tray of food outside his door for every meal, never pushing, never demanding. She gave him space, an incredible gift he didn't know he needed. He'd occasionally see her through his window, walking Buddy by the lake or tending to her garden, her movements calm and purposeful. He felt a deep, gnawing shame. He was a freeloader, a broken man imposing on the kindness of a stranger. He should leave, but the thought of facing the world again was paralyzing. The outside world was a place of failure and judgment. Here, in this quiet cabin, he was just Ethan. No fancy title, no 6-figure salary, no beautiful wife. Just a man with a broken body and a shattered spirit. On the 3rd day, he ventured out of his room and found Eleanor on the back porch, reading a book. She looked up and smiled, a genuine, welcoming smile that held no pity. "There you are," she said simply. "I was just about to make some tea. Would you like a cup?" That night, a storm rolled in across the lake. Wind howled through the pines and rain lashed against the windows. The power flickered and then died, plunging the cabin into darkness, save for the dancing flames in the fireplace. Eleanor lit a few candles, their soft glow creating an intimate, confidential atmosphere. "Quite a storm," she said, settling into her armchair. "These ones always make me feel like talking." Ethan sat across from her, watching the fire, feeling the warmth on his face. Something about the storm outside and the safety inside made the walls he'd built around himself begin to crumble. "My wife is pregnant with another man's child," he said, the words coming out before he could stop them. He expected shock, or disgust, or pity. Instead, Eleanor just nodded slowly, her eyes full of a deep, sad understanding. And so, he told her everything. He spoke of his hard-scrabble childhood, his burning ambition, his meteoric rise, and his dizzying fall. He told her about Jessica, the woman he had adored, and how she had systematically dismantled his life and his heart after the accident. The words poured out of him, a torrent of pain and confusion held back for too long. He confessed his darkest moment on the Overlook, the quiet decision to end his own life. He spoke of the shame that had become his constant companion. When he finally finished, the cabin was silent except for the drumming of the rain and the crackling fire. He felt exposed, raw, but also lighter, as if lancing a wound had finally released some of the pressure. Eleanor remained quiet for a long time, her gaze fixed on the flames. He wondered if he had scared her off, if his ugly story had shattered the peace of her home. "Thank you for telling me that, Ethan," she said at last, her voice soft but steady. "It takes a great deal of courage to be that vulnerable." She leaned forward, her expression serious. "You may feel like your life is over, but I promise you, it's not. Sometimes the universe has to burn everything down to the ground so you can build something better, something stronger, in its place. I should know." The way she said it with such weary conviction made him realize that this kind, gentle woman had her own story, her own scars hidden beneath her calm exterior. "I wasn't always a lonely old woman in a cabin," Eleanor began, a wry smile touching her lips. "I was a professor at Columbia. I had a wonderful husband, David. He was a surgeon, a brilliant man. We had a son, Michael. We had a life, a full, noisy, beautiful life in a brownstone on the Upper West Side." Her smile faded. "We lost Michael in a car accident when he was just 19. It broke something in David. He was never the same. He passed away from a heart attack 5 years later. I think his heart just gave out from the grief." She paused, taking a deep breath. "I was alone. The brownstone felt like a mausoleum. My only living relative was my granddaughter, Alison, Michael's daughter. After Michael died, her mother remarried and moved away. I hadn't seen Allie since she was a little girl." She looked at Ethan, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I was so lonely, Ethan." An aching, soul-deep loneliness that felt like a physical illness. And then, one day, she showed up at my door, all grown up and beautiful. It felt like a miracle. It felt like the universe was finally giving me a piece of my son back. "Allie was wonderful," Eleanor continued, her voice filled with the phantom warmth of a happy memory. "She started visiting me every week. She'd bring groceries, help me with errands, and just sit and talk for hours. She introduced me to her fiancé, a charming young man named Mark. They were getting married. I was so happy for her. I finally had family again." She sighed, the sound heavy with sorrow. "One day she came to me with a proposition. She and Mark were trying to get a mortgage for a house, but because of some complicated inheritance laws at my age, they were worried that if I passed away, the brownstone would get tied up in probate for years, and they'd be hit with a massive estate tax. It all sounded very official and complicated. She asked if I would consider signing the deed over to her as a gift. She swore up and down that nothing would change, that I could live there for the rest of my life. It was just a formality, she said, to protect her future." Ethan's legal mind, dormant for months, began to stir. He felt a cold dread creep up his spine. He knew exactly where this story was going. "She looked at me with my son's eyes," Eleanor said, her voice barely a whisper, "and she asked me, 'Grandma, you trust me, don't you?' Of course I did. She was my blood. So I went with them to a notary, and I signed the papers. I didn't even read them closely. Why would I?" She let out a short, bitter laugh. "I spent that summer up here, at the lake house, just like I always do. When I went back to the city in September, my keys didn't work. There was a new lock on the door. I went to the building management and they told me the apartment had been sold. I tried to call Allie, but her number was disconnected. I went to the address she had given me for her fiancé, but the people there had never heard of her." She looked directly at Ethan, her face a mask of pain. "They sold it, Ethan. My home. The home I shared with my husband and my son for 40 years. They took everything. And the worst part isn't the house. The worst part is that my own granddaughter, my son's child, could do that to me. I haven't just lost my home. I've lost my past and my future." Hearing her story, something inside Ethan shifted. The self-pity that had been poisoning him for months began to recede, replaced by a cold, sharp anger. It was a familiar feeling. It was the anger that had fueled his entire career, the righteous fury he felt when he saw an injustice. Jessica's betrayal was personal, a crime of the heart, but what had been done to Eleanor was a calculated predatory act of fraud. It was a legal problem, and he, Ethan, was a lawyer. "Eleanor," he said, his voice firm and clear for the first time in ages, "what you've described is a classic case of real estate fraud and elder abuse. The way they isolated you, gained your trust, and then pressured you into signing documents you didn't understand. It's textbook. He felt a surge of adrenaline, the old fire returning to his belly. This is what I do. Or what I used to do. We can fight this. Eleanor looked at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and fear. But how? I have no money for a lawyer, and I don't think I have the strength to face her in court. You don't need money for a lawyer, Ethan said, a determined glint in his eye. You've got me. I'll do it pro bono. And you won't have to face her. I'll handle everything, but I need you to do something for me first. He leaned forward, his mind already mapping out a strategy. I need you to grant me a limited power of attorney. It will allow me to act on your behalf, to file paperwork, and to access the records I need to build our case. We'll need to go to a notary in town tomorrow. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about his pain, his crutches, or his ex-wife. He had a mission. This wasn't just about getting Eleanor's home back. It was about reclaiming a piece of himself. It was about proving, if only to himself, that he was still a capable, competent man, not just a victim. Eleanor stared at him, tears welling in her eyes, but these were not the tears of grief he'd seen before. They were tears of gratitude and of a fragile, newfound hope. "Okay, Ethan," she whispered. "Okay." The next day, they drove into town and found a small law office that also offered notary services. The simple act of being in a legal environment, of speaking the familiar language of affidavits and legal authority, felt like coming home for Ethan. With the power of attorney signed and notarized, he was armed and ready. Back at the cabin, he opened his laptop and dove into a world he knew intimately. The internet was his weapon. He started with the city's public property records. It was just as Eleanor had said. A quit claim deed had been filed, transferring ownership from Eleanor Vance to Alison Vance for the sum of $1. But then, just 2 weeks later, another deed was filed. A sale. Alison Vance had sold the multi-million-dollar brownstone to a numbered LLC for a fraction of its market value. It was a classic money laundering tactic, designed to muddy the waters and make the property harder to reclaim. Ethan felt a grim satisfaction. The criminals had been sloppy, they had left a trail, and he was going to follow it to the very end. His next step was social media. He searched for Alison Vance, but the name was too common. He needed more information. He ran a background check on the notary who had witnessed the signing. The man had a string of complaints against him and was associated with a disbarred real estate lawyer known for preying on the elderly. This was a professional ring. These were not just a greedy couple, they were predators who had targeted Eleanor. The anger simmering inside him boiled over into cold fury. He then had a thought, a long shot. He searched for Eleanor's late son, Michael Vance. He found an old, online obituary. In the list of surviving family members, it mentioned a daughter, Alison, and a sister-in-law, Michael's ex-wife, who had remarried and taken the surname Peterson. A quick search for Alison Peterson led him to a public profile on LinkedIn. The woman in the photo looked nothing like the girl Eleanor had described. This Alison was a veterinarian living in Oregon. She had graduated from Cornell. It was the wrong woman. Or was it? He felt a jolt of realization. "Eleanor," he called out, his voice tense with excitement. "Come look at this." He showed her the LinkedIn profile of the veterinarian in Oregon. "Does this look like your granddaughter?" Eleanor peered at the screen, her brow furrowed. "No," she said definitively. "Not at all. My Allie had dark hair." Ethan's heart pounded. "Eleanor, I don't think that woman was your granddaughter. I think she was an imposter." The relief that washed over Eleanor's face was staggering. The pain of her granddaughter's betrayal was instantly replaced by the clean, simple anger of being swindled by a stranger. "You mean Allie didn't do this to me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't think so," Ethan confirmed. "I think these people are part of a sophisticated fraud ring that targets seniors. They research their victims, find estranged relatives, and send in an imposter to gain their trust. The new information changed everything. This was no longer a messy family dispute. It was a clear-cut case of criminal fraud, and it was infinitely easier to fight. Armed with this new evidence, Ethan went on the offensive. He drafted a comprehensive lawsuit, citing fraud, unjust enrichment, and conspiracy. He filed it with the New York State Supreme Court and simultaneously filed a complaint with the District Attorney's Office, laying out the entire criminal enterprise. The next few months were a whirlwind of legal activity. He took depositions, filed motions, and engaged in a fierce battle with the high-priced lawyer representing the anonymous LLC that now owned the brownstone. The opposing counsel underestimated him, seeing only a man on crutches working from a laptop in a cabin. They didn't see the brilliant, tenacious legal mind that had once been the terror of Manhattan's courtrooms. Ethan ran circles around them. He subpoenaed bank records, tracked the flow of money, and slowly but surely unravelled the entire conspiracy. He felt more alive than he had in years. The physical pain in his back seemed to fade into the background, overshadowed by the thrill of the fight. He was no longer Ethan, the victim. He was Ethan, the advocate. The day they won was anticlimactic. The defendants, facing a mountain of evidence and a pending criminal investigation, settled out of court. The settlement agreement was simple. The fraudulent deeds were voided, and ownership of the brownstone was reverted back to Eleanor Vance, free and clear. The LLC dissolved, and its anonymous owners vanished back into the shadows, though the DA's investigation was still ongoing. Ethan called Eleanor from the courthouse steps to give her the news. Her joyful, tearful cry was the greatest payment he had ever received. "You did it, Ethan," she sobbed. "You gave me my life back." "No, Eleanor," he said, a genuine smile spreading across his face. "We did it, and you gave me my life back first." That evening, he also had another piece of news for her. He had tracked down the real Alison Peterson. He had sent her a carefully worded email explaining the situation, and she had responded almost immediately, horrified and deeply concerned for the grandmother she hadn't seen in over a decade. She had given Ethan her phone number. The two women were scheduled to have their first video call that very night. Watching Eleanor reconnect with her real granddaughter was a profoundly moving experience. They cried, they laughed, and they began the slow, careful work of stitching their family back together. With the case behind him, Ethan knew he couldn't stay at the cabin forever. He needed to rebuild his own life. The case had not only restored his confidence, but it had also given him a new sense of purpose. He didn't want to go back to the cutthroat world of corporate law. He wanted to help people like Eleanor, people who had been chewed up and spit out by the system. He used the last of his severance money to set up a small, virtual law practice, specialising in elder law and real estate fraud. He worked from a tiny rented room in a town just outside the city, building his client base one case at a time. He also dedicated himself to his physical recovery, pushing himself through grueling physical therapy sessions. Slowly, the constant pain began to subside. He graduated from 2 crutches to 1, and then to a cane. He was getting stronger, both physically and mentally, every single day. A year passed. Ethan's small practice was thriving. His reputation as a fierce advocate for the underdog was growing. He moved into a slightly larger apartment, one that didn't feel like a temporary holding cell. He visited Eleanor and Buddy often, sometimes in her reclaimed brownstone in the city, and sometimes at the lake house, which had become his personal sanctuary. They had become a family, an unlikely trio bound together by shared trauma and mutual respect. He was happy, or at least content, but there was a piece of his past that remained unresolved, a question that haunted him in quiet moments. The child. Jessica's child would be over a year old now. Was it a boy or a girl? Did it look like her? Did it look like Trent? Or, despite everything she had said, was there a chance it looked like him? He knew he had to see for himself. He needed to close that chapter of his life for good. One crisp autumn afternoon, he put on the one good suit he still owned, took a deep breath, and drove to the last place on earth he ever wanted to see again. He stood outside the familiar door of the Tribeca loft, his heart hammering against his ribs. He could hear a faint rhythmic sound from inside, a kind of frustrated wail. Taking a steadying breath, he pressed the doorbell. The door swung open to reveal a version of Jessica he barely recognized. Her once perfectly styled hair was thrown into a messy bun. She wore a stained sweatshirt, and there were dark circles under her eyes. The vibrant, confident woman he had married was gone, replaced by someone exhausted and overwhelmed. "Ethan?" she said, squinting as if she couldn't quite see him clearly. "What are you doing here?" She seemed more surprised than angry. "I came to see the baby," he said simply. She hesitated, then sighed and stepped aside. "Whatever. Come in." The apartment, once a pristine showroom of modern design, was now cluttered and messy. Toys and baby supplies were scattered everywhere. And on a playmat in the centre of the room was a small boy who looked to be about a year old, struggling to crawl, his little limbs moving in a jerky, uncoordinated way. His face was contorted in a grimace of effort. "What's his name?" Ethan asked, his voice soft, his eyes fixed on the child. "Leo," Jessica answered, her tone flat. "He has cerebral palsy. The birth was difficult." She said it with a chilling lack of emotion, as if reporting the weather. Ethan felt a protestative surge so powerful it took his breath away. He walked over and knelt on the floor beside the small boy. Leo stopped his struggling and looked up at him with wide, intelligent blue eyes. Ethan's blue eyes. He reached out a hand, and the baby, after a moment's hesitation, grabbed his finger with a surprisingly strong grip. In that instant, nothing else mattered. Not Jessica's betrayal, not Trent, not the lies. All he saw was this beautiful, struggling child who looked at him with an undeniable flicker of recognition. "Is he mine, Jess?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion, never taking his eyes off Leo. She shrugged, collapsing onto the sofa. "I don't know. Maybe." Trent took off months ago when he found out about the diagnosis. Said it wasn't his problem. "I haven't done a test. I can't afford it. I can barely afford to keep the lights on." The indifference in her voice was like a punch to the gut. She was drowning, and she was letting her son drown with her. A profound clarity washed over Ethan. The question of paternity was irrelevant. This child needed help. This child needed a father, and he was standing right here. "I'm going to help," he said, his voice ringing with a conviction that surprised them both. "I'm going to get him the best doctors, the best therapists. I'm going to pay for everything." Jessica looked at him with suspicion. "Why? So you can use him to take the apartment back from me?" He finally looked away from Leo and met her gaze. The man she was looking at was not the broken shell who had hobbled out of this apartment a year ago. He was stronger, whole. "No, Jess," he said calmly. "I don't want the apartment. I don't want anything from you. I just want to be his father." And looking at the hope that dawned in his son's eyes, he knew he had finally found what he had been searching for, a reason to build a new life, a better one, from the ashes of the old. The following year was a testament to the power of unwavering dedication. Ethan and Eleanor became a formidable team in managing Leo's care. They found a renowned specialist, and Leo underwent a series of surgeries and began intensive physical therapy. Ethan was there for every appointment, every painful procedure, every small victory. He was there when Leo sat up on his own for the first time, and he was there to cheer him on as he took his first tentative, wobbly steps with the help of leg braces. They became a family in every sense of the word. Eleanor, who had lost her son and granddaughter, found a new purpose as a doting grandmother. Ethan, who thought he had lost everything, discovered the profound, unconditional love of being a father. His law practice flourished, specializing in cases of medical malpractice and fighting for families with special needs children. He had found his calling, not in a high-rise office, but in the quiet, fierce advocacy for those who couldn't fight for themselves. He and Jessica divorced amicably, and she willingly signed over full custody of Leo to him, admitting that he could provide a better life for their son. Life settled into a new happy rhythm. Their days were filled with therapy sessions, trips to the park with Buddy, and quiet evenings at Eleanor's brownstone, filled with the sound of Leo's laughter. The lake house remained their sanctuary, a place to escape the city and simply be a family. One sunny Saturday afternoon, Eleanor hosted a small barbecue at the cabin. She had invited an old colleague and her niece, a kind-eyed woman named Natalie, whose own engagement had recently fallen apart. Eleanor, ever the subtle matchmaker, saw two kind souls who had been through the fire and deserved a second chance at happiness. As Ethan watched Natalie patiently help Leo build a tower of blocks, a genuine easy smile on her face, he felt a sense of peace he had never known before. He had lost a life he thought was perfect, but he had gained a life that was real, filled with a love that was earned, not bought. He had walked away from the wreckage on crutches, but he had learned to stand on his own 2 feet, stronger than ever before. The sun began to set over the lake, casting a warm, golden light over the porch. Buddy snoozed at his feet. Leo was giggling in Natalie's arms, and Eleanor was watching them all with a contented smile. Ethan looked at the scene, this beautiful, improbable family he had built from the rubble of his past. The road had been brutal, paved with betrayal and heartbreak, but it had led him here. It had led him home. He no longer measured his worth by the size of his bank account or the prestige of his job title. He measured it in the strength of his son's grip, the warmth of Eleanor's friendship, and the quiet promise of a new beginning that was sparkling in Natalie's eyes. He had been through the worst, and he had not only survived, but he had found a deeper, more meaningful version of success. He had found joy not in having everything, but in giving everything he had to the people who mattered most. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the best was yet to come. In the end, Ethan never got a paternity test. He realised it didn't matter who had contributed the DNA. What mattered was who showed up, who held a little hand during a painful procedure, who celebrated every tiny milestone, who loved unconditionally. He chose to be Leo's father, and in doing so, he became the man he was always meant to be. The ultimate twist wasn't about revenge or justice against his ex-wife. It was about the profound, life-altering power of choosing love over bitterness and responsibility over despair. His new life, built with Eleanor and for his son, became infinitely richer and more meaningful than the hollow success he had chased for so long. He learned that sometimes our greatest tragedies are just opportunities in disguise, pushing us to become the heroes of our own stories. Thank you so much for joining us on this emotional journey. If this story touched you, please give it a like, subscribe for more content, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. And let us know in the comments below, what do you think is the true definition of family?